Gates of Imagination presents The South Wind by Algernon Blackwood, read by Arthur Lane. It is impossible to say through which sense or combination of senses I knew that someone was approaching, was already near. But most probably it was the deep, underlying mother sense, including them all, that conveyed the delicate warning. At any rate, the scene shifters of my moods knew it too, for very swiftly they prepared the stage. Then, ever soft-footed and invisible, stood aside to wait. As I went down the village street on my way to bed after midnight, the high alpine valley lay silent in its frozen stillness. For days it had now lain thus. Even the mouths of its cataracts stopped with ice. And for days too, the dry, tight cold had drawn up the nerves of the humans in it to a sharp, thin pitch of exhilaration that at last began to call for the gentler comfort of relaxation. The key had been a little too high, the inner tautness too prolonged. The tension of that implacable northeast wind, the bise noire, had drawn its twisted wires too long through our very entrails. We all sighed for some loosening of the bands, the comforting touch of something damp, soft, less penetratingly acute. And now, as I turned, midway in the little journey from the inn to my room above La Poste, this sudden warning that someone was approaching repeated its silent wireless message, and I paused to listen and to watch. Yet at first I searched in vain. The village street lay empty, a white ribbon between the black walls of the big roofed chalets. There were no lights in any of the houses. The hotels stood gaunt and ugly with their myriad shuttered windows. And the church, topped by the crown of Savoy in stone, was so engulfed by the shadows of the mountains that it seemed almost a part of them. Beyond reared the immense buttresses of the Dent du Midi, terrible and stalwart against the sky, their feet resting among the crowding pines, their streaked precipices tilting up at violent angles towards the stars. The bands of snow, belting their enormous flanks, stretched for miles, faintly gleaming, like Saturn's rings. To the right I could just make out the pinnacles of the Dents Blanches cruelly pointed, and still farther the Dent de Bonneveau, as of iron and crystal, running up its gaunt and dreadful pyramid into relentless depths of night. Everywhere in the hard, black sparkling air was the rigid spell of winter. It seemed as if this valley could never melt again, never know currents of warm wind, never taste the sun, nor yield its million flowers. And now, dipping down behind me out of the reaches of the darkness, the newcomer moved close, heralded by this subtle yet compelling admonition that had arrested me in my very tracks. For just as I turned in at the door, kicking the crunched snow from my boots against the granite step, I knew that, from the heart of all this tightly frozen winter's night, the someone, whose message had traveled so delicately in advance, was now, quite suddenly, at my very heels. And while my eyes lifted to sift their way between the darkness and the snow, I became aware that it was already coming down the village street. It ran on feathered feet, pressing close against the enclosing walls, yet at the same time spreading from side to side, brushing the window panes, rustling against the doors, and even including the shingled roofs in its enveloping advent. It came too, against the wind. It flew up close and past me, very faintly singing, running down between the chalets and the church, very swift, very soft, neither man nor animal, neither woman, girl nor child, turning the corner of the snowy road beyond the cure's house with a rushing, cantering motion that made me think of a body of water, something of fluid and generous shape, too mighty to be confined in common forms. And as it passed, it touched me through all skin and flesh upon the naked nerves, loosening, relieving, setting free the congealed sources of life which the bise so long had mercilessly bound, so that magic currents, flowing and released, washed down all the secret byways of the spirit and flooded again with full tide into 1,000 dried-up cisterns of the heart. The thrill I experienced is quite incommunicable in words. I ran upstairs and opened all my windows wide, knowing that soon the messenger would return with 1,000,000 others, only to find that already it had been there before me. Its taste was in the air, fragrant and alive, in my very mouth, and all the currents of the inner life ran sweet again and full. Nothing in the whole village was quite the same as it had been before. The deeply slumbering peasants, even behind their shuttered windows and barred doors, the curé, the servants at the inn, the consumptive man opposite, the children in the house behind the church, the horde of tourists in the caravanserai, all knew, more or less, according to the delicacy of their receiving apparatus, that something charged with fresh and living force had swept on viewless feet down the village street, passed noiselessly between the cracks of doors and windows, touched nerves and eyelids, and set them free. In response to the great order of release that the messenger had left everywhere behind her, even the dreams of the sleepers had shifted into softer and more flowing keys. And the valley also knew. For as I watched from my window, something loosened about the trees and stones and boulders, about the massed snows on the great slopes, about the roots of the hanging icicles that fringed and sheeted the dark cliffs, and down in the deepest beds of the killed and silent streams. Far overhead, across those desolate, bleak shoulders of the mountains, ran some sudden softness like the rush of awakening life, and was gone. A touch, lithe yet dewy, as of silk and water mixed, dropped softly over all, and silently, without resistance, the Bise Noire, utterly routed, went back to the icy caverns of the north and east where it sleeps, hated of men, and dreams its keen black dreams of death and desolation. And some 5 hours later, when I woke and looked towards the sunrise, I saw those strips of pearly grey, just tinged with red, the messenger had been to summon, charged with the warm moisture that brings relief. On the wings of a rising south wind, they came down hurriedly to cap the mountains and to unbind the captive forces of life, then moved with flying streamers up our own valley, sponging from the thirsty woods their richest perfume. And farther down, in soft wet fields, stood the leafless poplars, with little pools of water gemming the grass between, and pouring their musical overflow through runnels of dark and sodden leaves to join the rapidly increasing torrents descending from the mountains. For across the entire valley ran magically that sweet and welcome message of relief, which Job knew when he put the whole delicious tenderness and passion of it into less than a dozen words.